to say I'm very excited to be here with you all.
Thank you.
We are
Thank you for
too.
doing this. I'm
Me
excited.
too.
It's
Thank
great
you.
to see everyone, it's refreshing. It's a breath of fresh air because Washington has been extremely toxic. It's been on toxic overload. The first time we got to breathe was, of course, the inauguration, but we're back to the grind now because these folks, they tried to wreck the federal government.
Yeah, and I would love for you to give us your firsthand account on that because I can't imagine how scary that must be.
You know, what I share with folks is that I unfortunately have been through a number of really tragic circumstances as an elected official in like that immediate space that have been traumatizing. For instance, 9/11, I think all of us can relate to how traumatizing that was. But then I had a colleague assassinated before me when I was in the New York City Council. And,
Yeah.
so I guess I built some coping equipment along the way. And so the insurrection, given my proximity to it, because I was in my office, I was astounded, but it was almost like an out of body experience because I'm watching my colleagues by television, essentially, going through this. And I'm sheltering in place, being quiet in case they end up coming my way. So it was crazy, but thank God no one in terms of colleagues were, the worst did not occur. Let's put it that way.
Right.
Everybody's having to deal with it. And we did lose people's lives in this thing. It's and then, there's the who's part of this, insurrection group and who's not. And you got to, now we go through metal detectors to get onto the floor of the House. We never had to do that in the years that I've been a member of Congress.
Yeah, and the difference is you have to be looking around like who is involved in this. You don't even
Exactly.
know.
You can't even
That's
trust your own
that's the sick
your
part of
own
it. I mean, they had a colleague that had to be stopped going to the floor carrying a gun. I'm like, why are you packing? What is that about? After an insurrection,
I know David.
what goes through your head?
Right. Well, look, I think people are ready to get started. And man, and I did think about you immediately, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, because you know how much love I have for you. So I'm always looking at your feed to see what's going on. Like, okay. But
I'm good. We got the word out pretty quickly because my phone was blowing up, my mom's phone was blowing up, everybody's phone was blowing up.
Well, I do want to welcome everybody who is watching to our amazing panel that we have happening tonight. And this is all for the Shirley Chisholm Cultural Institute. So what we're doing here today is talking to you about what we have going on, what our hopes are. We want to get some feedback from everybody watching on what you would like to see happen. So first and foremost, before we even get started, we were having some conversations and y'all got to see some behind the scenes things with Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, who I love, representing Brooklyn. She actually has Shirley Chisholm's seat. And so I know Shirley Chisholm has inspired you and means a lot to you. So one of the first things that I want to do is have Congresswoman Yvette Clarke just speak on Shirley Chisholm, what her legacy means to you.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Angela, for that wonderful introduction and to everyone here present. Good evening, everybody. As has been stated, I'm Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke, and I proudly represent you in New York's 9th Congressional District. I'd like to thank Barbara Bullard, her team, the leadership, members, and friends of the Shirley Chisholm Cultural Institute for inviting me to greet you this evening. Nothing brings me more or a greater sense of joy than to be together with you in celebration and commemoration of the late, great, honorable Shirley Anita St. Hill Chisholm with the Shirley Chisholm Cultural Institute. Shirley Chisholm was a quintessential Brooklynite. Like many other Brooklyn families, she was the product of an immigrant family, the daughter of Afro-Caribbean immigrants, and she lived her American dream. Out of all that she has done, the Honorable Shirley Chisholm was, again, the quintessential Brooklynite. She lived her American dream out loud. Her trailblazing leadership, her charismatic persona, in concert with her audacious eloquence and her sheer elegance, she brought to the world our fight for justice through the embodiment in a petite woman from Brooklyn. With her fortitude in the face of adversity and her dignity intact, she is an icon who has endured the test of time and continues to pave the way for Black women in government, in service, in politics. She is, because she was, I am. As you may know, I was just reelected to my 8th term in the House of Representatives and hold the seat, which in part was represented by Congresswoman Chisholm. The gravity of holding this historic seat fuels my passion for the people I represent, my commitment and dedication to their well-being and their quality of life in the district, which is my home and has been my home all of my life. As the only Black Congresswoman in New York State, I revel in the opportunity to champion those who are less fortunate and underrepresented. I feel compelled to do so because I know that Shirley Chisholm fought for me. She championed my cause. She paid it forward. And I know because I'm a direct beneficiary of her legacy, and I am doing likewise. Congresswoman Chisholm's legacy and commitment to New York and her beloved Brooklyn community have guided the way that I govern myself and have led in our community. And it is an honor to walk in her footsteps. Let me also take this moment to celebrate the work of the board of the SCCI, President Barbara Bullard, my Caribbean American sister Angela Yee, both of you for your commitment and dedication to perpetuating and expanding on the Honorable Shirley Chisholm's legacy. The Institute, which Congresswoman Chisholm incorporated in 1977, is a beacon for the educational and cultural advancement of our children and has created many new ways and resources that lead to increased family stability. Tributes to Congresswoman Chisholm, such as SCCI, are truly a monument to Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm's legacy and are critical to educating current and future generations about the Congresswoman's leadership and her emotional story. When you walk into my office in Washington, D.C., I have a tribute to Congresswoman Chisholm on my wall. I've also introduced in past Congresses and plan to introduce in the coming months a bill to commission a statue of Congresswoman Chisholm to be placed in our nation's capital. Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm was a woman who dared to be a catalyst for change. I've pledged to do likewise, which is precisely how I intend on maintaining her legacy. Her audacity proved to be powerful. She was indeed a catalyst for change, and that catalyst continues to change the landscape of political discourse and representation. The maintenance of her legacy provides a roadmap for changing the status quo and is an inspiration to me and untold others. Just as she declared in her signature catchphrase and the title of this conversation, I vow to be unbought and unbossed, to speak truth to power, to use the power vested in me by the people of the 9th District of New York to address the issues that plague our community. I too am unbought and unbossed. I took an oath to represent the great people of Central and South Brooklyn, and I will continue the fight for the life and for the to continue the fight for the life and death issues that matter to Brooklynites each and every day, just as Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm did. So let us move forward and do the work. Everyone, it's great to be with you. I want you to stay safe, stay strong, stay healthy and stay blessed. And don't forget to stay socially distant and wear your mask. As they say in Washington, D.C., Angela Yee, I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you so much, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke. And you stay safe as well, okay? Because there are things happening that I would have never anticipated. So we also want to send you our love and make sure that you stay safe. But I'm so happy you're here to continue doing the work that you've been doing. Nobody better to honor Shirley Chisholm than Congresswoman Yvette Clarke. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And give your mother our love as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Well, we appreciate that. And, next up, I do want to introduce Barbara Bullard and Montserrat Mendez from the Shirley Chisholm Cultural Institute, just to kind of give you guys an overview on what the Institute is doing and thus far and what our anticipation is.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend a little time with us. And I love you, Angela. And Angela's one of our amazing board members, by the way. She's awesome, as you guys know. But the Institute, as Congresswoman Yvette Clarke has stated, is from 1977. And in 2018, Mr. William R. Howard passed away, who had been at the forefront of Ms. Chisholm's legacy for decades. Before people were even talking about her, really, he was out there saying, Shirley Chisholm, Shirley Chisholm. He was her legislative aide for over 40 years, her chief financier in terms of her campaigns, so many other things. And so I've worked with Bill for over 15 years, almost 2 decades, by the way, in terms of pushing forward Ms. Chisholm's legacy. And when he passed in 2018, I felt like I could not let it go to sleep and I couldn't let it die. And so we brought together an amazing team, an amazing board, Angela Yee, Carlisle Leach, Wendy Tyson. We have also Jamara Wakefield and Montserrat Mendez, Cheryl Davis, and these people work in different industries, from Jamara Wakefield being a queer artist and culture writer, to Carlisle Leach, who's also developed many programmings in terms of education and business, to Cheryl Davis, who writes for Law and Order, and she's also an entertainment lawyer. And I can't forget Nico Branch, who is the CEO and founder of Ms. Jessie's. So we've been very thrilled in terms of how we're bringing this together. We're looking at culture in the 21st century to be able to provide opportunities for self-sustainability in all ages, not, all genders, all ages, and to be able to be inclusive in terms of providing digital campaigns and programming in this time of COVID as well, to inspire and to actually support and empower. So that's basically a brief overview of the Institute. You guys can check us out online. We're there at shirleychisholminstitute.org. And we definitely produce a lot of digital campaigns and producing a lot of video campaigns in terms of inspiring and also supporting what's happening in terms of the landscape, especially for people of color. Thank you.
Thank you. And Barbara's the one that's gotten us all together. Montserrat, I don't know if you wanted to speak and say some words. No pressure.
I'm gonna say thank you to all of you, and thank you for Congresswoman Clarke for joining us. Thank you, Angela, for doing this. I am a direct beneficiary of Shirley Chisholm, even though I didn't know who she was until 2012.
Wow.
Even though I went to school in Newark, New Jersey, and it wasn't until 2012 when I started working on a film script about her life. Somebody said, "Oh, you should write a film about Shirley Chisholm." And I was like, "Who that?"
That's a shame, right? That we don't learn about Shirley Chisholm the way we should.
And it's incredibly shameful. And as I learned about her, I got to know Barbara and I got to talking, and Barbara and I got more involved in the community. But as I saw the work she did for education, I realized that I benefited from her work. When I was in Newark, I wasn't planning to go to college. I basically did a program which was part of Head Start, which Shirley Chisholm defended, called Training Inc., in which students with a higher than above average get sent to a special college classes to take computer training and school training and all that stuff. And what ended up happening was that I did really well. And when I graduated, because I didn't have the money to go to college, I ended up working for Congressman Donald M. Payne, who is an amazing force. He was so amazing. And I remember when I would walk into his office every day, every morning, I would work directly with the community. He would, every time he came to New Jersey, he would just walk in the office and he goes, "Have you started applying to college yet?" And I would like, "No, I don't plan to go to college. I'm working for a congressman." I was like, well, I don't, every day he was like, "Oh, how you, and he would bring me packets of college applications, and he was like, no, you're the future. You need to go to college and you get yourself educated. And so in a roundabout way, it was the work of Shirley Chisholm with Head Start, which brought me to Congressman Donald Payne, which ended up with I'm a little nervous here, but which ended up me becoming an artist, a writer, and then ended up at the Shirley Chisholm Cultural Institute. I think it is just a beautiful miracle of the work she did for the community and how it impacted people that, through years past the time she left office.
Well, thank you guys so much. And on that note, and to your point, right, we don't want to assume that everybody knows Shirley Chisholm's legacy. And so that's why we have Dr. Zinga Fraser here to just really break it down and educate everybody on what they may not know, because we never want to assume that people they're not as up to date as they should be, because it's definitely not. I didn't learn about her in school myself. I had to do my own research. And that was because I won a Shirley Chisholm Award, a distinction award. And that's what made me say, okay, let me go back. I'd heard her name, but I didn't know enough. And so I went back and did my research, but you are here to kind of fill us in.
So thank you so much, Barbara and Angela, for having me today. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to come before you to discuss Shirley Chisholm. I'm the director of the Shirley Chisholm Project at Brooklyn College, which is Shirley Chisholm's alma mater. And I am responsible for her intellectual and historical legacy to ensure that everyone knows, understands, and really conceptualize who Shirley Chisholm was, as well as connecting Chisholm to a current discourse. So Shirley Chisholm, just like Congresswoman Yvette Clarke discussed, she was a daughter of Brooklyn. She was a daughter of immigrants. We talk about her as being the first African-American woman to be elected to Congress, and the first woman and the first African-American to run on a major party line for the presidency. But Chisholm was much more than a first. She was a community organizer. She was an educator. She went to Brooklyn College, then she gets her master's degree at Teachers College at Columbia University, which I'm an alum from. And so it is a part of understanding who Chisholm was, is really her investment in Black and Brown and marginalized people. And that was intrinsic to her, who she was, and her involvement in politics, which starts in the 1970s, but really starts in the early 1960s when she runs for the New York State Assembly, and she becomes the second African-American woman to be elected in the New York State Assembly. So even though she is a person who, blazed the trail and crossed many kind of boundaries, she was always really connected to grassroots and organizing people. As a young woman, she worked for the NAACP. She didn't work for the NAACP, but she joined the NAACP. She created her own organization because she felt that there weren't any Black women organizations at Brooklyn College. So she started her own organization. And then later down the line, she joined a historically Black a sorority called Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, which I'm a member of as well, and as well as my soror, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke. So she's connected to Black women. She's connected to Black and brown people. She sees what's going on in Bedford-Stuyvesant around the time in which she lives, and she really becomes disheartened as a college student, not as an older woman. We think of Miss Chisholm as, this older woman because of the pictures, right? But just imagine, this is a young woman who is in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and she sees that, trash isn't being picked up. And she goes to community meetings and she's asking the question, why are we not receiving the same kind of services that white communities were receiving at that time? And so all of those kind of things, as well as her father being a Garveyite, are things that really connected Chisholm to a politics and an ideology of upliftment and racial pride and equality.
Ooh.
So that's my spiel. I mean, I can talk more, but
Wow.
Well, no, and to your point, I want to talk about like being the first, because right now we are in historical times, right? With our Vice President Kamala Harris, and Congresswoman Yvette Clarke had been working with Kamala Harris on getting this statue of Shirley Chisholm, to your point, to be there. So I want to ask you guys, just on a personal note, what were your feelings when you saw that Kamala Harris was going to be our first ever Black woman vice president? Because I know I didn't expect to be so overcome with emotion when I was watching, and I started crying. I was on the plane and I'm watching on CNN, and I was like, why am I so emotional? I'm crying. But it is so important to have that type of representation. So I want to know what you guys were thinking when all of this was happening.
Well, I'll speak first. I think that when it was happening, we were all working on some institute projects. And I was so emotional, but yet I was like, we have to stay focused on Miss Chisholm's legacy. Like it felt like my whole body became like this one beam of fire. Like I just had to not become unfocused. I could not become distracted. I had to become more focused due to the fact that now young people can see themselves in that position and beyond. And so I think that our role here is to ensure that happens, that we push the envelope, that more of us are in those positions and can see ourselves in those positions.
Super important. And I want to bring in David Johns here. David, and David Johns and I have done a lot of work together, and I so much appreciate you because you are always educating me on things also. And I'm always super happy to share my platform with you whenever we have things going on. I'm always like, please, we need David Johns. And, listen, even offline, we communicate. So just let people know the work that you do at NBJC.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Yi. You, since day one, have been an advocate and a supporter and a friend of the work of NBJC. And for that, I will always say thank you. Always thankful for the sacrifice and leadership of Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, and to you, Barbara, my friend, to you, Zinga, my Columbia University friend, and Montserrat, my new friend. I thank all of you for inviting me into this space. There are two contributions I think that are important to make at this point. And one is to push on a point that you've already all made, which is that we would not have the ability to celebrate this moment in the movement for Black lives and the demand for radically inclusive social justice and the ability to talk about intersectionality in the way in which the previous administration tried to make illegal if it were not for Shirley Chisholm, right? Things that often get missed are that she spent her entire career advocating for issues that are at the forefront of intersectional needs of the most marginalized communities. I was highlighting, she fought for enlisting women into public service, publicly funded daycare, parental leave, civil rights for Black people throughout the diaspora, voting rights for all, and women's reproductive freedom. And so often we have conversations about like what's at the forefront of our agendas, whether it's the Black agenda, the Latinx agenda, whatever agenda. Shirley Chisholm was on this stuff before we got to it. So we should just be clear about that and say thank you. The second thing is that she did not do this because people gave her permission. Quite to the contrary, Shirley Chisholm was able to achieve as much as she was able to achieve without the support of people who were responsible for advocating for the same things that she made unyielding priority, right? And so I noted and thought it important to share that when she ran for president, Black men, Black male colleagues, which is why, again, I celebrate being able to show up as a feminist in the space of Black male feminists. Black male colleagues felt that she had not consulted them and that she had betrayed the group's interest by trying to create a coalition of women, Hispanic or Latinx folks, white liberals, and welfare recipients. She, like Dr. Martin Luther King, like Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, understand that not only are there no permanent entries that are enemies, they're permanent interests, but that we only win when we understand the importance of coalition building. And she was as successful as she was in her presidential bid because of that. And then the third thing should be no surprise to anyone who knows that the National Black Justice Coalition is the nation's only civil rights organization intentionally and unapologetic at the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA+ equality. And while Shirley Chisholm was not a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, she was and still is an icon. She was one of the first candidates, especially presidential candidates, to endorse issues that were specific to the LGBTQ community. She understood and recognized and talked very publicly about the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which you, Angela, because we've done so much work together, know continues to disproportionately affect members of our community, Black, cis, heterosexual women in particular, which often gets lost because we still think about it as a gay disease. She understood that it wasn't. And she advocated for addressing through policy and through social practice the kinds of shifts that we're still working to advocate for today. And so as we talk about her, I want to make sure that the expansiveness of her understanding of how we get free by building coalitions, addressing issues that affect those of us with multiply marginalized identities, and doing so without apology and not waiting for permission. For me, those are all major keys that young folks should still be following today so we can continue to ensure that her legacy is enshrined and outlives all of us.
Right. And we were in some scary times just now when Donald Trump was president, and a lot of progress that we made had gotten rolled back. But as we can see now, we have to keep our foot on next right now, because I do feel hopeful and I see that things are getting done already, but we still have a lot of work to do. So I thank you, David, for always being there to do the work. And, you know, on that note, I do want to talk about voting rights, right? Because this is something that we just saw the power of our vote in so many different ways just now in Georgia, you know, in Pennsylvania. We saw how powerful our vote is and how much people will try to tell you your vote doesn't matter, how they try to suppress the vote, question, you know, if everything was done fairly. We still have issues with that. We saw what happened in the Capitol, where people were they try to convince us that Donald Trump, you know, won the election. So let's talk about voting, right? And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because Shirley Chisholm voted and supported civil rights legislation that helped voters vote. She believed that a person's power as a citizen was in their one vote, and she had to find and organize in original ways to make sure her vote and her people's vote counted. So I would love to talk about voting and just what's been put out there, what we just learned right now, most recently with this last election.
Congresswoman, do you want to go first?
Well, you know, I will. Let me just say, let me just say that, you know, there's no doubt, as an original member of the Congressional Black Caucus, the recognition as the only female founder of the Congressional Black Caucus, representation matters. And the way that we ensure representation in a democracy is to use our vote. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is something we all need to be advocating for in Shirley Chisholm's name. We know that when that piece of legislation is passed, we will have really crossed the Rubicon in this country, where the value of the vote to every eligible citizen is one that is respected. What we have been experiencing, you know, to this point, and have had to overcome in many ways is the devaluation of the vote of people of color, of Black people in particular, but as we can see, that extends to Latino, Native American. There has been a consistent strain of pushback coming from white supremacy that has denied the full franchise of every American. And so what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act does is it guarantees that. And it puts in place all of the measures we need to protect the vote, to protect the voter, and to advance us as a matured representative democracy, which is the ultimate goal of who we are as Americans. So I'm excited about moving forward with that. It's not going to be easy. And everyone who is affiliated with this evening's program, you know, the activism days are not over. We cannot stop until all of our key demands are met. And one of those demands is the passing of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So that's my perspective. That's what I'm seeing in Washington. We're going to have to do some very serious work to make sure that this legislation is passed.
Yeah, and I lead a 501c3 organization, but can recommend that everybody call their senator in particular and ask them to prioritize the passage of the companion bill once it comes through their chamber. As is often the case, the members of the CBC will continue to do the work and ensure that it gets through the US House of Representatives. Heretofore, the challenge has been the Senate. And we have a very small majority, a tie-breaking majority. And so call your senators and ask them to prioritize this bill. And at the risk of being persnickety, I want to highlight that voting is an important and critically important part of ensuring that the experiment of democracy, the American experiment of democracy is maintained. And in particular, I want to highlight that the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill is the more recent evolution of the initial Black Bill of Rights that was introduced by the Congressional Black Caucus. Who at the time was 13 people. Again, Shirley Chisholm was the only woman in this group of men who advocated for so many things that we continue to see informing the agendas of organizations that care about the diverse needs of Black communities. And so if you look at that original bill, it included a full-time employment program and guaranteed, we're now calling guaranteed basic income. It included racial equality, reparations, investments in education. All of y'all know that I'm forever talking about teaching the babies, right? And all of those things are represented not only in NBJC's 2021 policy agenda, but they show up on the Movement for Black Lives in their bill, in their comprehensive bill, asking for similar things, ending the war on Black people, reparations for past and continuing harms, divestment from things that we know continue to harm us to invest in education and community-led programming. And so I say this again to ensure that people understand that too often, especially as we look forward to February, we do this like reflexive remembering of people who advocated for things that affect our lives on a daily basis, as if that work is done. Right? This is a part of us like coloring these pictures to remind folks that like, while we didn't have color processing back then, like it wasn't that long ago. And so there are opportunities every single day to join organizations and support organizations like NBJC or the Movement for Black Lives, to volunteer in the offices of folks like in Zinga at Brooklyn College, or the office of Congresswoman Yvette Clarke in the home district RNDC, to ensure that we are advancing the policies that are required to support practice shifts so that one day soon we can all get free.
And one point I do also want to insert here is that, you know, when you say, when we were talking about the vote, I just kept on thinking about Shirley Chisholm during the time of her campaign. It's probably the last weeks of the convention, the last days of the convention, and she's yelling to people, "You only have one vote." And Montserrat and Barbara, well, you know, that's a part of the kind of thematic framework of Chisholm really begging at this time begging a coalition of Black and white women, right? So Black men, we talk about the ways in which Black men did not support her, but not all Black men. There were a significant portion of Black men that actually did support Shirley Chisholm. If we think about those who are a part of the Black Panther Party, Percy Sutton, there's a whole composite of Black men, or a part of a narrative of Black men who supported Chisholm when she's running for the presidency. But I will point back to a part that Chisholm is always talking about, the ways in which voting rights is essential. If there wasn't a Voting Rights Act, there would not have been a Shirley Chisholm.
That's right.
Because of the ways in which our districts during the 1960s were so gerrymandered. Chisholm had to run 3 times in the state assembly because of the ways in which they were trying to disenfranchise Brooklyn voters. The district at that time was cut up so crazy. I know it's cut up crazy now, but it was cut up even crazier, where there really was an inability and a concerted effort to ensure that Black people in the district did not have representation.
Right.
And so it's important to think about the long historical trajectory of people continuing to fight. So people that, as we saw happen in Georgia, but we continue to think about the ways in which people in New York City, people in Brooklyn, people in Harlem are continuing to have a fight, even in liberal spaces that we normally think, oh, there's no problem there. But the ways in which the districts, and that's why census, that's why the Shirley Chisholm Project was so integral in trying to get the word out in terms of everyone participating in the census, because of the important role it played in not only gaining resources in our community, but the ways in which it crafts who is able to represent whom. And then lastly, I think about what we thought about the significance and the important role of Black women who demanded President Biden and for a VP seat, and demanded from the Democratic Party to elect and select a Black woman for that seat. This historic moment of Kamala Harris is the direct result of Black women exercising their political power and the refusal of the calls to say that, you have to engage in a certain kind of political pragmatism, or that you're asking for too much. It is the direct result of these Black women saying, no, we are going to change the racial and gender trajectory of who can have the seat and what role they will play politically in our country. And that is the kind of support and the importance of looking at a constituency that in many ways I've been writing for a long time have been dismissed by the powers that be within the Democratic Party. And so looking at Kamala Harris being our first vice president is not distracted from the ways in which Black women organized, demanded, and refused anything less than what they asked for. If we want to congratulate them from being the saviors, which I hate, the saviors of the democracy, the saviors of the Democratic Party, then you owe us something. And you owe our constituencies something.
Along those lines, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Zinga Fraser, I want you to, because I don't want to misquote this, but I know Shirley Chisholm would often say that it was harder being a woman than it was being Black in politics. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, she was talking about the ways in which Black women were marginalized even within their intraracial groups, right? So the ways in which people really didn't understand the importance of Black feminists. Like, she wasn't the first Black feminist, right? We can connect it all the way back to Anna Julia Cooper's and others, right? Harriet Tubman. All of these women were feminists, but the ways in which we framed feminism as being a white framework or white political ideology. And so Chisholm gets a lot of the backlash from, you know, this kind of heteronormative masculinist framework of what political ideologies need to be and how Black women need to operate. And so she definitely did come up against a lot of sexism. But she would also tell you, I mean, there are tons of stories of this, of the racism that she encountered in the halls of Congress. You know, there were occasions where people did not, for example, when she's fighting against being placed on the agricultural committee. And she says, we know that a tree grows in Brooklyn, but that committee doesn't support the constituencies that I am, you know, supportive of, or the constituencies in Brooklyn. And she fights for a new congressional committee. And that was unheard of at that time. And she got a lot of flack for that. But she also talked about the ways in which some Black men in the political leadership, whether it be in Congress or in Brooklyn. She really endured the sexism of that time. But she also would talk about the ways in which racism was pervasive in terms of seniority, in terms of the rules of Congress, all of those kind of things.
Now, David, I know earlier you did bring up the Black Bill of Rights, and it's so interesting to look at what was the Black Bill of Rights that was written back then, and Shirley Chisholm was part of that, and compare it to what we're asking for now, right? So let's talk about what was in that Black Bill of Rights: a full employment program, a guaranteed annual income system, an end to American military involvement in Vietnam and all African countries, 15% of all government contracts for the use of Black businesses so that they can develop financially, racial equality, the war on Black people must end now, a guaranteed income, reparations, investment in education of the Blacks of the nation so they can build their own rising class that can lift this nation's success in technology, space exploration, and science, a comprehensive plan for a universal care system for every citizen in America, known as the National Health Insurance Program. Now, mind you, they were asking for this in 1972. Here we are in 2021. It's kind of the same things.
And they brought it to Congress on June 5th, 1972. And it blows my mind that these are the things that we're asking for now. And I want to talk a little bit about how Shirley talked for the Puerto Rican constituents in her district. She was one of the first Congress people to talk fully in Spanish. And she was one of the first people who made my own. I remember my parents and people in my community talk about her like she was the only one representing them at one time. Because there were not that many Spanish people speaking in Congress on their behalf, and she kind of made it seem possible that we have AOCs today because of Shirley Chisholm. But the fact that they were fighting for the same thing on June 5th, 1972, and there is the same things we're fighting for today, is sort of it's up to us to keep up the fight.
We could copy and paste that into today and be like, these are the things that we need.
Absolutely.
You know, so let's talk about like Black Lives Matter and their list of demands: end the war on Black people, reparations for past and continuing harms, divestment from the institutions that criminalize, cage, and harm Black people, investment in the education, health, and safety of Black people, economic justice for all, and a reconstruction of the economy to ensure our communities have collective ownership, not merely access, community control of the laws, institutions, and policies that most impact us, and independent Black political power and Black self-determination in all areas of society. So how close are we to achieving any of these things than we were back in 1972, do you believe? Yeah. What do we need to do?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. And I want to reframe it by acknowledging that the anchor, the root, what's at the core of, or rather the thing that tethers both agendas together, is a recognition of the things that we need as people of color, people from marginalized communities, to get free. And we should understand that by design, this work of dismantling the institutions that have been designed to preserve white supremacy, and doing the work of dismantling what Black feminists refer to as the matrix of domination, the things that allow the privileges to exist and seem invisible all at the same time, it's a whole lot of work. And so when I think about especially just in the last year, the number of community-led policy shifts that have been focused on addressing the issues on these lists, there's so much worth celebrating, right? If we step back and think about the additional number of people from incredibly diverse communities who are in elected official positions throughout the country, that's worth celebrating and a result of Shirley Chisholm's legacy. When we think about the shifts in divesting from police departments who we know are not working in ways that often serve the needs of our communities, and investing in community participatory processes, or investing in resolving unresolved mental health needs, or dealing with prolonged exposure to poverty, all of these things are worth celebrating. As well, we have federally the passage of things like the American Affordable Care Act, right? We saw under President Obama, still my president, I don't know who y'all talking about, and this other dude who's erased from my mind. We saw the most significant investment in education here too, for at every level, right? An investment and acknowledgement of early childhood education, which hadn't been seen heretofore because there were two agencies, the Department of Education and Health and Human Services, who were talking about the importance of early care and education, not just babysitting. I'm spending a little bit of time here, but the point I'm trying to make is that there's a whole lot of work that we still have to do. Let's be clear. It is why I have the position that I have, quarterbacking the team at the National Black Justice Coalition. And if we're not clear about framing it appropriately, it can seem like it's an impossible task for us to continue to commit ourselves to. But that's why there's so much that, again, I highlighted, and my list is not exhaustive, it's illustrative. There's so much for us to celebrate, including having Kamala Harris in the position that she's in, having the ability for this new administration to appoint somebody like Susan Rice, who's dedicated her career to answering some of these tough questions and advancing some of these policies. It's why, for the first time ever, 4 of the largest progressive LGBTQ organizations are led by Black people, not people of color, Black people. All of these things are a result of the labor that people have invested heretofore and are aligned with the things that we all know we need to continue to advocate for, which is an acknowledgement of our power, an investment in our communities, and an atonement for the wrongs that the state, that the government continues to exact on Black bodies at every level.
And Angela, I'd like to add that, Shirley Chisholm's legacy in the context of the, Black Caucus Bill of Rights, it's like her legacy is like Bebe's kids. It doesn't die, it multiplies. We now have 27 Black women in the United States Congress. And what's unique about this is that when you talk about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the fiercest champion of that legislation is a woman named Terry Sewell from Alabama. She's been a huge champion. When you talk about reparations, you can't say reparations without saying Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who has introduced legislation and mobilizing the Congress to look at this. I think it's HR 40, which is a look into, of course, a study. What do we need to do to really drive home reparations? Yes, I saw someone in the chat raise Barbara Lee. That Barbara Lee speaks for me. She's a direct disciple of the Honorable Shirley Chisholm, and she's in leadership where she is determining, as a member of the Steering and Policy Committee in the House, the direction we take, whether it's anti-war stances, whether it's equity in the COVID response, dealing with education. So on so many different levels, you have Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, who is chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus. So the legacy of Shirley Chisholm is with us right now and is moving forward on the agenda that she helped craft to liberate our people. And so I think there's a lot of optimism in that space. And when we look at the women who are going to be serving in the Biden-Harris administration, all again, women, leaders, leader servants, and in service to the people. It's an extraordinary time that we're in. And I can attribute and trace so much of it back to the sacrifices of the Honorable Shirley Chisholm, the blows that she had to take in order to really advocate for our community and be that face. And now we've got a team, a broad bench that we couldn't have imagined, whether it's in the federal government, the state government, the municipal government. Black women are running down the trail that Shirley Chisholm blazed and are moving forward with the agenda for our communities that she began.
Well, I do, and thank you
And
so
so
much for that. Barbara?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm just, I'm almost like teared up here inside, because we all here on this panel are doing the work at light speed, and we don't sleep, we eat it, right? We sleep and eat it. Y'all know we do. So I'm just honored just to hear Congresswoman Yvette Clarke speak these words, and everyone else on this panel. And I just wanted to say that I'm being quiet today, y'all, because I want you guys to let it out.
Well, and one of the reasons we're being quiet is because Barbara and I talked about it. We want to sort of hear from you about ideas that we can put into action at the Shirley Chisholm Cultural Institute. My main concern, and I think I talked to this with Barbara yesterday, is the fact that we're, over the last year, Black and Brown children who have less access to technology are falling behind on their education. And so my concern is, how do we actually do something, and how does the Institute get involved in doing something to help stop some of the gap that's going to form, because Black children are going to fall behind again.
And I think a part of the optimism of the moment is also connected to the ways in which Chisholm goes against the grain, right? So we're all glorifying who she is, right? But we also have to understand that when you're advocating for an issue around the digital divide, when you're advocating against high stakes testing, when you're advocating for more resources to be allocated in school districts, when you're advocating for some of these things, and because of the title of the conversation is Unbought and Unbossed, also requires you to have an audacity to go against the grain of the political powers that be. Right. And so in the historical context, Chisholm wasn't loved because she was unbought and unbossed. She was hated. Like, we have to be honest to understand that in order for us to stand in the gap for our children, to stand in the gap for our communities, requires us to be connected to them, but also to get familiar and actually settle in the space of not being liked, being disliked, being hated, and really going to those, because I'm from Congresswoman Yvette Clarke's district. I worked for Congressman Major Owens. I worked for Shirley Chisholm's district, right? And it requires us to go to those school board meetings, right? So the politics that Chisholm would say is, while the national politics are indeed very important, we have to be very integral and very strategic, in which Shirley Chisholm doesn't get the respect in terms of her strategies of understanding how the local politics were working, right? There wouldn't be a Bedford-Stuyvesant corporation. All of those things were local initiatives that Chisholm is advocating for. And it requires us to go into our communities. And what I'm more optimistic than ever is because of the organizing that I've seen happen in Brooklyn and Harlem and all over in Queens, around and all over the nation, that you having people who say, hey, you know what? I'm not taking a passive stance. I'm going to my school board districts meeting. I'm going to, to talk about the ways in which redistricting disenfranchises people who live next to me, because we no longer can afford the rent in our neighborhoods.
Right.
And so it really requires us to catch on to what Unbought and Unbossed, but it also requires us to require more from our local leadership, as well as our national leadership. And that may not necessarily be a nice way, right? We may not be beloved by everyone, but those are the requirements that we need for our community.
See, even in this, Zinga, you're being too damn nice, which is to rephrase that and say we should expect for it to make people uncomfortable.
Yes.
The kinds of demands and shifts that we need, we know are going to make people uncomfortable, not just white folks, but some of our skin folk who also aren't kinfolk. And so let's shift into that space and hold each other accountable for being uncomfortable so that we can see radical and necessary change.
Now,
Well, Dr. Fraser and Dr. Johns, as they say here in Brooklyn, haters are gonna hate. Have got to just do the work.
And if they don't work for you, then you know what you need to do, right? So it's all about being accountable. So if you don't work for me and you don't vote for me and you don't align with me, right? When we think about Black women and Hispanic women in terms of maternal birth deaths, right? In terms of their connections, when we were talking about reproductive justice for Shirley Chisholm, she understands it's not just about giving a woman the right to choose, but it's talking about the health disparities that existed in the 1960s that still exist in 2021. Yes. I should not receive the lesser amount, regardless of my class status. I'm still perceived as I can take pain harder than white women, that I will receive less or less adequate service in terms of healthcare. And so those are the things that we have to make people accountable for.
Now, I wanted to get to like a couple of these questions before I know this flew by. So, I at least want to get to a question here. All right. It was mentioned that Shirley Chisholm was of West Indian descent. Similarly, Mr. Montserrat mentioned her outreach to members of the Latinx community. How well are we doing today at collaborating and aligning our efforts across members of the African diaspora? It often feels like we draw lines between each other rather than working together.
Ooh.
We can do better. I mean, here's the thing. My frustration is that these kinds of questions are never asked of white folks, as if to suggest that like the work of coalition building isn't something that everybody has to struggle through, and every community doesn't have unique challenges to that. And so, yes, there's more work that we can do to identify the parts of our agendas, acknowledging we are incredibly diverse, where there's synergy. And there are more strategic ways that we can work together where there are areas of divergence. Highlighting, for example, the ways in which the previous administration's immigration policies disproportionately affected those of us who are connected to the African diaspora is one of those examples. Highlighting the ways in which reparations is something that is owed to American descendants of transatlantic enslavement, that includes a legacy that very much touches the Caribbean places of experience and origin, is another example. And so I want to say, without equivocation, there's work to be done. And there's so much that we have to celebrate, right? Whether it is the diverse representation of women leaders in Congress, as was already referenced or alluded to by Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, or the rate at which progressive federal policies in particular are being passed that don't name but acknowledge the diversity that is really the reality of the plurality of the people that exist in our country now, and that exists within our communities, is also worth acknowledging.
Now, here's one more question. With the continued oppression of Black people in the United States, at what point do we accept that a nation founded on genocidal and white supremacist principles may never be structurally capable of honoring Black humanity? Even Shirley Chisholm once said that although she was not optimistic about America's ability to change, given its structural resistance to change. You're like, oh, everybody.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I think that's a given in terms of the institutional structures of this country and what it was formatted and framed on. But Chisholm was also an advocate of working and understanding and strategically working within a system to transform that system, right? So she would always say that she's a catalyst for change, and that means restructuring that system, right? And so she, just as David Johns' shirt says, right? So it's about restructuring what that system is. And that doesn't mean that there's you throw everything in the fire and just let go, right? She's saying, well, then you create organizations like the Congressional Black Caucus,
Right.
or you create, whether it's the National Welfare Rights Organization for women, specifically advocating for working and poor class women. And so there are ways in which we can create and liberate ourselves collectively as well as individually.
Right. And
In that spirit, I don't want us to crumble under the weight of white supremacy. And my frustration is that the way that the question is framed almost suggests that there's no way to get away from the fact that institutions now work exactly as designed. And so let me offer a different way of thinking about this.
We have to evolve.
Not only do we have to evolve, we have to shift the way that we're thinking. So right now, there's a Black student, college student named Nia Dennis, who is a UCLA gymnast. And what I know, I'm from Inglewood, California. Gymnastics was a white sport, like hockey, like other things that we don't necessarily do because common sense and other stuff in the world. Gymnastics is not one of them. But this young woman, this phenomenal Black woman, had a floor routine that was so authentically Black, and that was so excellent in terms of any way that anybody could ever talk about gymnastics, that everybody's had to bow down. And I offer this as an example to say, I would much prefer us to have conversations about the fact that this country is one where we have seen time and again descendants of enslaved Africans not only endure, not only show up, but show the hell out in spite of the fact that institutions work exactly as they are designed to. And let's let that be the legacy that suggests to us in the radical way that Octavia Butler imagined that we could exist in a world of Afrofuturism, in the radical way that Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin sat in a Paris salon smoking cigarettes in the 60s, talking about the intergenerational lessons that we had to learn to get over. What I really want is for us to be filled with the contributions that we continue to make in spite of, rather than the weight of institutions that really privileged white people had a whole lot of time and luxury in designing to ensure that we wouldn't win, and we continue to do so in spite of that. I just want us to shift the way that we think about and ask questions, because it opens up possibilities for answers that otherwise are forestalled.
And I'm going to
imagining Black joy. What does that look like, right? And so that's Shirley Chisholm wearing her mink coat when she wants to, right? And wearing her colorful dresses, right? It's the ways in which we can see ourselves and be authentic to who we are, and not have this kind of dogmatic framework of what freedom looks like within institutions.
And then there's also the fact that Shirley, or Mrs. C, as I like to call her, was a great strategist. She was a chess player. She knew she would make a move way ahead of other moves. I remember doing the research, and when John Lewis invited us to his office to do research on her, and when we talked about the shooting of George Wallace, and she went to visit him in the hospital. And so many people, particularly Black male leaders, said, "Oh, don't do that, don't do that. You know, they're just gonna," but she says, "This is gonna pay off for me down the line." And then in Congress, several years later, she would just call him up and go, "Hey, I have this bill. Some of the Southern people are not voting my way. Can you give them a call?" Because they became great friends. And she used that strategy, and she used her charm, and she used and she was joyful about using it. She wasn't she wasn't dogmatic in that way. She was a humanist. And I think that we need to start to use strategy in the system that exists now to break the system like Shirley did.
And I think we are in that space as we speak.
Yes.
And I think part of it is the audacity that is a Shirley Chisholm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's that salmon that swims upstream when everyone else is going in the opposite direction, right? The bottom line to it is that this is a very young nation compared to nations on the planet. And what is unique about the Constitution, flawed as it may have been by the men who drafted it, who crafted it, is that it provides some real, opportunities if we embrace our citizenship, utilize our franchise, we recognize that even in the electoral space, where you have in one election cycle, a Black woman coming very close to becoming the governor of Georgia, and in the very next election cycle, kicking both Republican senators to the curb and giving Joe Biden the margin of victory, that can only happen in a representative constitutional democracy. We are coming of age, and Mrs. C taught us something about the power of that and who we are, knowing who we are, and using and unleashing that power. And it came to fruition before our very eyes. The one thing we have to remember that we must do is stay woke, stay engaged, and continue to move forward, building on the legacy of the Honorable Shirley Anita St. Hill Chisholm.
Now, Barbara, this is the perfect time for you to close us out, because I know the whole point of this was for us to talk about actionable things and what you guys want to see happen for the Shirley Chisholm Cultural Institute moving forward.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is it's all about for us is being on the ground and understanding the power that we have, and everyone has been expressing that. And what we're looking at is developing programming within our communities right now in the middle of COVID, also to develop digital online production skills for our young people so that they can be self-empowered. They're not waiting for anyone to give them anything, because we already have the power and we already have the creativity. It's the fact is how do we strategize in the mindset of Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm and to be able to bring that together in a whole form. And we're looking at partnerships, and we're also bringing in teams of creatives, because art is the revolution, y'all. You know, so we're about that, you know, and many other things, but we're looking to be able to provide sustainable programming to talk about the at-risk issues of education, because that's real, health issues, health disparities that's in our community. So we're here. Hit us up online, hit me up via email, call me or whatever, call the team. But we're starting now. We're starting to celebrate also Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm run for president from now through next year. So you guys will be included in terms of how that's going to roll out. We want to make this large. We want to have a statement. We want our young people to be inspired and know that they can too, right now, be participant in their own power.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Barbara. You are amazing for pulling this all together. And of course, thank you to all of our participants. My boy, David Johns, I love you so much. Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, Dr. Zinga Fraser, Montserrat Mendez, I appreciate and love you guys so much. And we have a lot of work to do, but at least we know we have that optimism, like we said, and we see the work is getting done. So we got to keep pushing forward.
Thank you.
Thank you so
and
much.
Donate.
Yes, and where can people donate?
ShirleyChisholmInstitute.org. We're online. Yes, it'll be helpful for us as well in terms of moving forward.
The revolution.
Invest in the work. Y'all
Yeah.
got money. Y'all paying for these fancy broadband connections. Shout out to you, Angela, for always being the moderator with the mostest. I appreciate
Thank you,
it.
everyone.
You're amazing.
Thank you, guys.
Blessings. Thank you.